I don't think it's a problem that robots and automation are going to take over our jobs. I think it's a problem that it's not happening and it's not going to happen. And what's preventing it from happening is that we keep creating jobs for people. And as long as we keep using economic policy to create jobs for people, we can't reap the full benefit of labor-saving technology, and that includes AI.
Resistance is futile.
Welcome to the podcast,
where we explore what's happening with AI, business, automation and culture, and ask,
where on earth is all this going?
Our guest today is Alex Howlett from the Greshm Institute in Boston, and he'd like to see a universal basic income used not to counter the threat of AI and automation, which is the more common reasoning, but instead to free people from work that isn't required. Whether it's filled by AI and automation or not is another matter. So are we thinking about AI and highly advanced automation backwards? My concern, but different to Jamie maybe, is that AI and automation might not be coming for our jobs at all if we don't change the underlying economic paradigm. Everyone needs a meal ticket currently. People will always find a way to undercut the expense of automating somewhere in the economy. Ask yourself why Britain still has car washing services done by hand. So Alex's research was kind of a confirmation for me. Maybe we should aim to use a market signal, money, to deliberately get rid of the work that doesn't need doing and that no one wants to do anyway. Now, Jamie is away because he's also a keynote speaker at various events on all things AI and automation, but he's given me some questions on top of my own to ask. So Alex, welcome to Resistance is Futile. How's Boston this morning?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Boston's nice. It's still dark here, but it's good.
Britain is pretty much still in winter. It's May over here. It's supposed to be summer. It hasn't even started, but I digress. You've obviously not been overrun by dancing robots from Boston Dynamics just yet, so that's good. Could you tell me a bit about the Greshm Institute and how you arrived at universal basic income as a cause to put your energy behind?
Yeah, so I became interested in universal basic income in about 2011, definitely in 2011. And the Greshm Institute is an organization we formed officially last year in December 2023. And it's really kind of putting an official stamp on what I've already been thinking about. And we have two other guys, Derek Van Gorder and Philip Jackson. And the three of us are trying to build the intellectual foundations for universal basic income. So the universal basic income movement is huge. There are a lot of people kind of fighting for it as a political thing and talking about it. But we wanted to add some more kind of academic, intellectual substance there to really kind of get to the bottom of it.
Sorry to jump in, but anybody coming new to the idea of universal basic income, is there a back of envelope kind of description that I know there's different versions of it, there's BN and so on, but just maybe your concept of it for anybody who doesn't know?
Yeah, so universal basic income is a way of getting people money. It's essentially the government handing everybody in the economy, every citizen, the same amount of money on a regular basis. No strings attached. There's no work requirement. There's no means test.
Okay, now the hype machine from the big tech companies, right, has always made it look like AI-powered robots will be marching into our offices and factories and taking over our jobs sometime next week. But you're not convinced this is a problem. In fact, you seem adamant that we won't lose jobs in aggregate to automation without a UBI. Is that a fair reading of your ideas?
I don't think it's a problem that robots and automation are going to take over our jobs. I think it's a problem that it's not happening and it's not going to happen. And what's preventing it from happening is that we keep creating jobs for people. And as long as we keep using economic policy to create jobs for people, we can't reap the full benefit of labor-saving technology, and that includes AI.
And I mean, you don't strike me as somebody who would have thought that this is all being designed somehow. This is just a cultural phenomenon and a technological phenomenon. We've arrived at this problem that we kind of have a blind spot to, do you think? I mean, how have we arrived at this space where we aren't letting automation take over jobs and changing the economy deliberately to facilitate that?
Well, I think this is a problem we've kind of always had. There's this expectation that people get their money through jobs. There's this assumption that if the economy is at quote unquote full employment, then that somehow allows the economy to reach its full potential, that kind of thing. But if you are creating jobs for the purpose of employing people, then you're not creating jobs for the product of the labor. So what ends up happening is that we overemploy people and force them to spend their time and effort unproductively or less productively in order to earn money. And that's because we need to get money into people's pockets so they can buy stuff. And if we had a way of getting people money that was independent of the labor market, then we could benefit from labor saving technology by eliminating all the jobs we don't need and really kind of unlock the full or more of the potential of labor saving technology such as AI.
And we are going to have to, come to the elephant in the room, which is that some people, or most people, I think, assume that somehow their job is important. And I think it's important to people's sense of purpose that they think their job's important too. But we will come to that. I think it's a really important part of what you've uncovered. But for someone sitting at home thinking, if this is introduced tomorrow, and we should talk about why a calibrated level of UBI, not a set level, but nonetheless, would it allow them to stop working? Would you agree with them, or would it not work like that?
Well, it depends what you mean by allow. So right now, anyone's free to stop working if they want to. They just won't get paid anymore. So the universal
not really
basic
free,
income,
are they? Because they would eventually run out of money and starve.
well, freedom is a continuum, right? Universal basic income is some amount of money that you get. And depending on the amount, like it can be any amount. Sometimes people assume it's just enough to meet basic needs, or at least enough to meet basic needs. That's not really part of the definition. So it could be a very small amount of money. And if it is, then that doesn't give you very much extra freedom to quit your job. If it's a large amount of money, then it gives you a lot of freedom to quit your job. And that threshold in terms of like what it actually allows you to do is going to vary by the person, how much money they feel like they need to, live a decent life. Usually the cutoff is not like starve or not, but, are you comfortable, kind of getting by with less? How much less are you comfortable getting by with? So yeah, I mean, for some people at, most levels of UBI, they would be more free to quit their jobs. And then another concern is, would the jobs still be there? So, I like to remind people that currently in today's economy, labor supply is artificially inflated. So that's workers want to work more than they otherwise would because they don't have other sources of money. But labor demand is artificially inflated as well. So firms are hiring more workers because instead of basic income, what we do is we use monetary policy to push money into the financial sector, and that money goes into the funding of firms, and that kind of boosts the amount of money flowing in the economy and creates jobs. That's how we create jobs, that kind of through this indirect monetary policy. So universal basic income can be instead of that. So there would be fewer jobs available in a universal basic income world, or they would pay lower wages, right? On average, right? Some jobs might pay more. So when we transition to a universal basic income world, it's going to feel different because the amount of paid labor is going to go down. The wages are going to go down kind of in aggregate. And that comes both from the worker and from the employer.
And I think that's what's hard for people to picture in the practical is like, how would they experience getting, getting more money coming in, and then choosing to not work will feel very disruptive, I'm sure, at first, or at least even if it went really smoothly, the anticipation of it would feel really disruptive. Is there an easy anecdote perhaps, or, not quite day in the life, but like the sort of thing that someone would experience if they started getting a UBI and they were, a office worker or something like that on a pretty average salary? What do you think would happen? What's your expectation?
Well, you want to, any kind of big change to how the economy works, any big change to any parameters in the economy, you want to gradually phase in, right? You don't want a sudden shock to the economy. So it's not like, oh, suddenly we're giving everybody, you know, $3,000 a month or something like that, and now everything has to adjust, right? And there are a lot of dislocations and that kind of thing. No, that's not what you would do. You would start with a small amount and gradually increase the amount so everything can kind of adapt organically. I think that's the biggest thing. Just because you're doing something big doesn't mean you should do it all at once, because the economy is working a certain way now. And you don't want to break things along the way, at least not any more than necessary.
Yeah, I understand. So even if you put the architecture in place and you go, look, it's possible now to pay everybody $1 a month for now, and then you slowly, like you've said, calibrate it. And that calibration, would that be in conjunction with, I mean, I've last week talked with Ty Keynes, who's a system dynamics practitioner, and he was modeling UBI, among other things, in an economy-wide model based on the status quo, basically, without changing anything else. And you could see what would happen if you brought it in at like a $1,200 a month stipend level, and it was just like pulling a whole lot of things out of whack. So that calibration is a big part of your study, so that it's not tied to a human right kind of argument, which is brought up a lot. It's like, well, everyone needs this minimum amount. Well, a minimum amount in a big city is very different to a minimum amount required in a small town. So you could actually, give people a lot more choice about where they live if it's calibrated up, right? So those are the sorts of behaviors I think would start to happen. So it's incredibly complex what would happen if you calibrate up and you slowly introduce it. Do you think it's a question of calibrating it in slowly, but keep going up until stuff starts to happen? I mean, that's the bit I think is fascinating. What sort of things do you and who manages, how it's calibrated and what effects are positive, if that makes sense?
Yeah, well, the question is what level of universal basic income is optimal for the economy? And we can't know ahead of time, right? The only way to find out is by feeling it out. And if your model is kind of assuming the status quo and that the economy kind of works the way it does now, and we add in a basic income and we're calculating, how that affects, people's incomes, you're not really going to see the macroeconomic effects of basic income, because it changes how money flows in the economy. And, if you're choosing to use basic income instead of excessively easy monetary policy, that implies higher interest rates. There are international implications too. So it's a really complicated thing. You have to feel it out. And conceptually, we can imagine that there's some level of universal basic income that lands us in a scenario where we're neither over-incentivizing labor nor under-incentivizing labor. Like, people aren't working too much, and they're also not working not enough, right? So you kind of want to hit that sweet spot. And it's the same thing for the financial sector, right? Monetary policy stimulates the financial sector, and that creates asset bubbles and financial instability and stuff like that. To what extent can we rein that in without, undermining, actually productive investment? So I don't think you can get there by kind of plugging basic income into how the economy works now.
Yeah, I understand. And I think there's a lot of talk about the things that ought to be reformed around it. And I guess if people were using the idea of AI and automation as an argument for all of this, I think it falls apart. It's a good catalyst for conversation, but once people are into it, it's like, look, actually, if you want if you want automation, and it's just the idea that it's backwards. And if we want AI and automation to take over more, I'm afraid we've got to do it a different way. It's not going to happen on its own. It's a really interesting and stimulating idea. So, Jamie had one other question, because you've answered his first one, which was about, would it accelerate uptake of automation and AI? And if they're less worried about people losing their jobs, they're going to be more discerning, right, about the work they take. And they likely will take work that pays them more to do something they care about, probably. I mean, that would be, you'd think, a good choice. But maybe not. I mean, it's a complex thing. But his other question was, how would a UBI be funded if overall numbers of workers were less? And this, of course, is implicit in most people's assumption that tax pays for government revenue, which you and I have different views on to the mainstream, I guess. And so how to approach that that's easy for people to understand if they're thinking, well, we can't do that because we can't fund a UBI because there'll be less tax in the system.
Yeah. I mean, so to answer this question, we have to think about where the money in the economy comes from. Money is constantly flowing through the economy, and it doesn't just necessarily go in a circle, right? It's not the case that a consumer spends the money, they buy some stuff that gets paid to the worker, and the worker is the consumer, and it just keeps going around and around and around. It doesn't quite work like that. Instead, there's borrowing, right? And most of our money is not created by the government; it's created by the private sector, issuing money into the economy through lending and borrowing. So the question to answer is, how much of our money printing, so to speak, do we really want to have happen in the private sector, and how much do we want to have kind of coming from the government itself? So with the universal basic income, you can imagine that the government is issuing new money into the economy to kind of flow through the economy, and kind of consumers purchase goods and services, that kind of thing, instead of the government stimulating the financial sector to push money down into firms that then pay their workers, and then consumers buy goods and services, right? So it's an alternative channel for money to get into the economy. New money is constantly flowing into the economy, and we can have it come from a more stable borrowing framework, right? If the government is a giant single borrower, they're not going to default, and they can issue money and spend it into the economy. Whereas the private sector is a bunch of different banks and financial institutions. It can get pretty brittle with interlocking, debts and that kind of thing. And you have asset bubbles and financial collapses and a credit cycle and a business cycle and booms and busts and all of that. Basic income can be an alternative to that. UBI can be an alternative to that. And concretely, what that means in terms of the government's balance sheet, if they are spending more money than they previously were, and you haven't changed anything on the taxation side, what does that mean? Well, that means more deficit spending, right? Like concretely, that's what it means.
And in that sense, it's basically a democratic decision, right? And not a resource decision, but not a financial one, because fiscal spending like that you're saying is democratic. You just go, right, the money is spent into the economy. I appreciate you think that the private sector creates money when it loans, although there's plenty of schools of thought that they're saying it's a question of double entry accounting. But whatever they are spending into the economy is balanced somehow eventually on the deficit. So there's double entry. It is taken into account. But either way, it seems pretty clear that this is a democratic choice and not a financial choice. We don't have to ask for the money from the private sector to pay for the UBI, if you see what I mean. Is that fair?
I guess I'm not sure what you mean by democratic choice. So in both cases,
because fiscal spending is democratic, right? So at some point, we voted for people who are going to spend that money into the economy. I mean,
it doesn't have to depend on any particular governmental structure, right? I guess in the UK where you are, in the US where I am, the governments are fairly democratic. But I would imagine that ultimately you would want to have some kind of government agency that is kind of politically independent, that is calibrating the UBI. So we have central banks that are like that now. You have the Bank of England, we have the Federal Reserve, and they are somewhat insulated from politics and insulated from democracy, right? The whims of the people saying like, we want easier monetary policy because we want higher employment or something like that. And the central bank can say, hey, we know what we're doing and we're not beholden to you. So there's kind of a non-democratic aspect to it, some insulation from the democratic process that I think is useful in the context of an agency like a central bank. And I think it would be useful for the agencies that's calibrating the basic income as well.
I see. So to remove it from the partisan politics is do that. Mm-hmm. But of course you need, I guess the spending of it at some point is going to be, if not politicized, then at least it needs some sort of mandate and ongoing mandate. But once removed, at least, would make sense. I get it. So yeah.
Yeah, and one could argue that the market is more democratic than the government too, because it's just individual actors acting, according to what they want. Of course, that's influenced by the government, right, through monetary policy. So they change the incentives in the market. So you could have a whole debate about what's more or less democratic. And I don't think that is necessarily a useful kind of framing.
Well, citizens and consumers are in antagonism. Like even the same person can be a consumer and a citizen. Those forces, though, are going to be in antagonism. There's no real escaping that. So you've got to grapple with am I a citizen in this moment or am I a consumer? Those are not equally democratic. There's two different. One's $1, and lots of people can have more dollars than others, and one's one vote. So I'm just calibrating that just to make sure we're talking about the same thing. Democracy, and at least in the UK, is about voting. It has nothing to do with market choices. That's not democratization. That's an American term.
Oh, okay.
You see what I mean? So that's the definition I'm making. But I get that it's used by entrepreneurs a lot to say we're democratizing it by giving more choice. I get that. But I'm meaning in the pure sense of democracy. Actually, what can you influence? What do you have agency to choose? Citizens and consumers are completely different, making different choices. I mean, as a consumer, you're going to need to buy a car that gets you from A to B. As a citizen, you might want to restrict the use of cars because together you realize that too many of them are bad. See what I mean? So those forces are in antagonism. But anyway, I don't want to.
So I would imagine that the original putting in place of the UBI would be kind of a fairly democratic decision, but then the actual process of calibrating the basic income would be more technocratic.
Good stuff. Yeah, understand. Makes sense. So for those that are committed to the idea of a full employment program as a way to protect the most vulnerable, right? And I get their concerns. So I see where they're coming from. UBI gets dismissed by those people often out of hand. Why do you think that is? And is there any kind of, how to put it, détente or policy set in which you could combine the best ideas of both at all?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are problems that UBI doesn't solve, and importantly, it's not a safety net. It's not supposed to be a safety net. It's not I mean, some people talk about it that way and want it to be used for that purpose, but I think that would be kind of missing out on the full potential of UBI. So instead of thinking about it as a safety net, instead of thinking about it as something that's kind of supposed to help the people who need the most help or something like that, we can think of UBI as just the normal way that money is distributed into the economy. And that's as opposed to the status quo of pushing money to people through jobs and through the market.
Yeah, that makes sense. What's your take on the commonly used criticism that UBI will just, mean landowners will put up rents and companies will just increase their prices, leaving most people in the same position, needing to find work for survival? Is there any validity to that, do you think?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think that's a problem with money in general, regardless of what the money source is. So UBI doesn't necessarily solve that problem. It doesn't solve that problem. What the problem that it solves is you have one source of money and then you have a more efficient source of money. So the problem exists when you're pushing money into the economy through monetary policy. And the problem doesn't go away just because you're pushing money into the economy through universal basic income. Maybe it's mitigated a little bit because universal basic income is a location independent income. So it gives you more freedom to live in a different place. So instead of everybody, kind of trying to bid up land prices near where the jobs are, or something like that, you might see cities that are currently kind of lower priced, get more people moving there. So you're not going to see kind of everybody spreading out into the countryside or something like that, because there are a lot of advantages to kind of living where other people are. But you might see more flexibility for population centers to grow in places where they're not growing right now.
And also the basic premise being that too much money chasing too few goods, which is the old argument for inflation, falls down if you do increase automation and generally productivity by having UBI, then surely that mitigates a lot of the inflation worries that people would have. I mean, that's not automatic, but that is, in theory, something that happens.
Well, I mean, yeah, if you have too much money chasing too few goods, that's inflation. So if you set the UBI too high, you're going to get inflation. until the inflation brings the purchasing power of the UBI back down to a level the economy can sustain. And that's true, again, regardless of what your money source is.
Very good. Okay, so let's talk about that cultural aspect of all of this that I hinted at before. So for an employer of even a small business, listening to this, it may not compute that any of the staff are not needed. Otherwise, they'd just get rid of them, right? So after reading David Graeber's Bullshit Jobs Under No Illusion about the fact that there might be some jobs that are, make work, but what would a calibrated UBI likely to do to both the labour supply and the labour demand? Because there's two sides of that coin. Maybe we did talk about it briefly, but I want to unpack that a bit more.
Yeah, so from the perspective of an employer, you're not hiring employees that you don't need, or at least if you do, it's not intentional, right? But there's also kind of a higher level question of which firms do we need, right? So if the way we currently get money is to make it easier for firms to fund themselves so they hire more people, then and we stop doing that, then some firms that exist in our world today might not exist in a UBI world. So I think if you're a small business owner, what you have to think about, and this is maybe not even an easy calculation, you have to think about, am I still going to be a viable business in a UBI world? Even if I'm paying workers the same wages, that kind of thing. Maybe I can't I can't issue debt, I can't fund myself, I can't get a bank loan or something like that because money is tighter, right? UBI is higher, money is tighter in the financial sector, in kind of for borrowing, that kind of thing. And then what does my customer base look like? Are they a bunch of workers who go to work at all these businesses that are only in existence because, money is easy and there's a lot of funding and that kind of thing, these businesses that wouldn't exist in a tighter monetary policy world? And we're seeing some of that right now, right? Because we have higher interest rates now than, we had 10 years or more of zero interest rates. Now interest rates are higher, and you're seeing some businesses face some funding stresses. And if you have a calibrated basic income in the back of your mind, and you reach a point where ordinarily the central banks would lower interest rates, you could say, well, no, let's just increase the basic income a little bit, right? Allow these firms to fail, so that a lot of them are hanging on for interest rates to come back down again, hoping they can survive long enough. The high interest rate environment long enough. But with the universal basic income, that high interest rate environment never has to end. So then the way to be a profitable business is to actually provide goods and services that benefit the people, instead of kind of convincing someone to lend you a bunch of money, that kind of thing. And, if the interest rates are zero, you can kind of roll over your funding forever. These kinds of like zero interest rate policies, ZIRP businesses, are going to be a thing of the past if we have high interest rates kind of on an ongoing basis.
My understanding would be ZIRP, even if done by a central bank, you'd still have private businesses setting their own interest rates. So you wouldn't necessarily get ZIRP throughout the economy, would you? It's just a policy term for central banks.
The
right?
policy rate, yeah. When zero interest rate policy sets the policy rate to zero, so that's kind of the overnight interest rate that banks borrow from each other is typically the rate that central banks target, the money market, overnight money market rate of interest. And then other interest rates are set at a spread above that. And those spreads can narrow and widen. But the idea is that when interest rates are lower, when the policy rate is lower, that pulls down the other interest rates, because the spread kind of stays the same, and the other interest rates go down as well. So you have
making finance tighter that way, as you see it, would then it's just going to flat out make a lot of make a UBI much more likely to just smash those businesses that are funding themselves on zero rates or close to, or were.
Yeah, I mean, basic income implies kind of tighter interest rates, unless you do something else weird with your economic policy to kind of cancel out the money that's flowing in through UBI. Because you can imagine we have two faucets that money's coming out of, and one of them is monetary policy, and the kind of the money's flowing out of there with low interest rates, easy borrowing, that kind of thing. And the other is UBI, where it's just the government borrowing directly, and the money's flowing out of there. So you turn one faucet down and turn the other faucet up and kind of keep them balanced.
There's a 2005 paper by a professor of Chicago University, Edgar J. Feige, and that was the automated transaction tax, one which would not like similar to the Tobin tax, but across the entire economy. So you could tax the economy at the transaction level. You have no more income tax. You have no other taxes at all, and that was one consideration based on that concern that if you don't necessarily need to use interest rates then you could still, but this is a much more efficient way of just taxing the economy. It was taken quite seriously by the Bush administration, but never came in because it would probably work and it would stop tax havens forever. So they didn't introduce it. But I tell you what was interesting was that when we were chatting, there was the you mentioned like a good example of how some of these businesses would struggle. You're talking about a coffee shop at the base floor of an office building full of ZERP businesses. And I think for those who are listening and going, ZERP, what are they talking about? And just maybe practically explain what you meant by that scenario and what would happen to the coffee business there in that circumstance.
Imagine you're a coffee shop at the bottom of a building in Silicon Valley where all of these kind of, startups, I don't know, cryptocurrency startups or something are kind of working, and they've got all this funding that, they've kind of sold their ideas to venture capitalists, and other funders, and they're really never going to do anything useful, but it's kind of a fad, and they're constantly losing money, but they're able to keep funding themselves, that kind of thing. Okay, you're a coffee shop down there, you're making a lot of money. Those employees are coming in, they're buying their coffee and their donuts in the morning. And what happens when all of those other businesses go out of business? You go out of business too. So you might not be thinking of yourself as a ZERP business, but you kind of are a ZERP business by extension. I know a guy, his name is Austin Mackle, and he calls this the beer can effect. So you're driving along on the highway and you kind of throw a beer can out your window, or I'm probably butchering the analogy, but the idea is now that creates litter, right, on the side of the road, and that's a job for somebody. So if you stop the littering, then those jobs go away. So you can think of ZERP, zero interest rate policy, as creating a kind of litter, metaphorical litter in the economy that creates jobs for other people.
That's a really powerful metaphor. I like it. So is it fair to say that now I'm bringing this back to the robots and AI automation just because that's what we talk about and audience is interested in it. However, is it fair then to say that overall, if we just start, in the scenario you've talked about where, some coffee shop goes out of business, they've at least got, we don't know exactly what the amount would be, but at least there's some income still coming in for them. And so it makes the transition to whatever else a lot smoother, right? So you end up with a much more flexible workforce, I would have thought. So that's going to facilitate, again, more automation. And I say AI, but what I mean by, and Jamie does as well, when we talk about AI, we're often talking about highly advanced automation only, right? And that can turn up anywhere in just software. It can turn up in robots on production lines, all sorts of things. So I think what it makes me think of is there's no easy way to know what the future would look like with a UBI, but the economics of it is completely different to what we've got now. And if we don't start talking about it more ahead of time and get familiar with these concepts and really start playing with them, it would seem like a huge missed opportunity as far as you're concerned. Is that a fair way of looking at it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think there.
Or do you think it's inevitable? I'm trying to gauge how you feel this would come about.
I don't think UBI is inevitable, and I don't think robots taking people's jobs are inevitable. But I do think what UBI does is it enables us to reap the full potential of labor-saving technology, right? So if you've got not just a UBI right now, but if you're calibrating your UBI, so there's a commitment to provide the economy with as much money as it needs to keep going, then everybody can know that if I invent a labor-saving technology, it's actually going to be put to, the fullest effect possible, and people are gonna actually use it. And so that actually creates an incentive to develop more labor-saving technology. So it allows our existing, kind of automation, AI, labor-saving technology to reach their full potential, but any future labor-saving technology as well. So that's a powerful stimulant to eliminating jobs, and not only eliminating the jobs we don't need, but making it so even more jobs fall into that category and more work.
And so if I was to ask you for the most positive version, the outcome that you'd most like to see, how would you describe it? What would you like to most see happen if a UBI was implemented this way? What would be the most positive thing for someone to experience, do you think, as an individual in that society?
Well, to the extent that poverty is caused by the way we get people, their money being broken, right? Forcing people to get jobs. Well, what if people can't get jobs? Then UBI solves that problem, right? So I don't know if it can solve. I'm confident that, in a UBI world, after a few years of, calibrating it, I think we can probably eliminate global poverty. But that's not part of the theory. It's just that there's certain, there's a certain component of poverty that's caused by the money distribution being problematic. So I imagine a world where we're eliminating one important source of poverty, and we're gonna be in a world where people aren't afraid of AI technology. They're not going to be afraid of their jobs being taken by AI or immigrants or anyone. That's, oh, I don't have to work anymore. That's fantastic, right? Now, the individual people, if you're getting paid a lot and your job gets eliminated, maybe you'd still see some of that, but you can't, you wouldn't be able to hide behind the argument that like, oh, I'm doing something important and I deserve to be paid. It's like, well, turns out that if you have a job today, and you're getting paid money, a lot of the, you can't really tease apart the components, but since the government is stimulating wages and stimulating employment, you're really getting a government subsidy to waste resources. And that includes your own time and effort, right? So if, there's not really much kind of moral high ground to stand on if you're arguing you want to keep your job. That just sounds like you're being greedy and choosing to waste your own time and other people's resources and other people's money and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a really powerful way of looking at it. Is there an international aspect to this in which if one country introduced a UBI, it would be either an advantage or a disadvantage? Have you given that much thought?
Yeah, this is one of the main things I'm thinking about today. Okay. And it depends on which country is doing the UBI, right? So let's say we're the United States. The US dollar is the global funding currency, right? So if the Fed increases interest rates, that increases interest rates for the global economy. We saw this, especially in the early 1980s with Paul Volcker at the Fed raised interest rates, and that caused the Latin American debt crisis, right? Because all of these countries were borrowing in dollars, and they had to roll over that funding, and then the interest rate was higher. So yeah, if the United States implements a UBI and that prevents the Fed from ever cutting interest rates again, or maybe they raise interest rates even further, what do you do internationally? Does it put other countries in a situation where if they don't also implement a UBI, then their economies are going to suffer a crisis or something like that. And my sense is maybe, yeah, this is in my mind, this is the most important avenue of research in universal basic income right now, how it affects the global economy. And that's true, if one country implements it, it's true if, well, what if you had a global basic income, like all of these dimensions, because we live in a global economy and this is macroeconomic policy, and macroeconomic policy affects the global economy, especially if your policy levers are at the center or the top of the global economy, right? Then everyone is kind of depending on you. So this is important.
And if finally the question I think is tickling around the back of people's minds, if they're worried about there's not enough people to do the work in general across the economy, because we're so used to the idea that there's all this work that needs doing. I think it's very hard to wrap your head around the fact that, well, hang on, if I don't want to work, things might grind to a halt, and suddenly the sewage is not, being correctly looked after and maintained, and the trash is not collected at the extremes. What's your take on whether there'd be enough people to do the work that needs doing?
Well, if there aren't enough people to do the work that needs doing, then you set your basic income too high. And what's going to quickly happen is you're going to get inflation, I think, as I mentioned before, and that will actually bring the real level of purchasing power the basic income can support down until people need to go out and get those jobs again. You don't want that would be disruptive to the economy, though, right? What you want to do is you want to figure out a way to calibrate it so that you don't end up overshooting and setting the basic income too high.
Yeah, I think that's a really compelling way of looking at it. And it neuters a lot of resistance that I find to just talking to people about UBI, is I think they have in their head a figure already in which everybody gets to just bunk off and do nothing, instead of, well, no, it just means that if it's at a certain level, and I think the calibrated concept that you've come up with through the consumer monetary theory is really clever in addressing that concern. And it just shows, well, actually, when we play with it, we find that natural level turns out to be probably, I don't know for sure, and I'm sure you don't either, but probably one in which we all work a lot less hours on the obvious economic meal ticket work, but we work more on more innovative, creative things that we don't even know what that will do to the economy. It could be really good. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, I think that's right. One way to put it is that the level of basic income the economy can sustain partly depends on how naturally lazy people are. So if people are like off the charts lazy, then just a little bit of UBI would cause everybody to stop working, then you can't have very much UBI. The natural rate of UBI for the economy is going to be very, very low, right? There's some people are lazy to some degree, right? But how much, right? And we don't know necessarily ahead of time. And there's also, the people who say like, oh, people need work, they need meaning and purpose. And of course, that's true. How much of that psychology is internalized work incentives, right? Social incentives to get a job and pull your own weight and provide for your family? Maybe a lot of it. How much of it would go away? How much of, if you change the culture, that changes the incentives, and then people start internalizing something different. That all kind of factors into, we need to get the incentives to work right. We needed balance so that people are actually spending their time productively. Because if you're over incentivizing work, then you're paying people to spend their time less productively than they otherwise would. If you're under incentivizing work, then you're also incentivizing people to spend their time less productively than they otherwise would. So you need to get the right balance.
Well, and I think it's a slippery term, isn't it, work, because it means so many different things to different people. And it's almost like, and there has been some work done on this, is what exactly do we mean by work? Because there's hard work, there's meal ticket works or survival work, but there's deep work. Cal Newport wrote a book called Deep Work, which I found really profound and affected the way that I think about my own work, is finding out what is the deep work that is valuable to your community. It may not be paid, and doing it anyway, and then maybe finding a way to get paid for it, but it doesn't have to be full time. You might have to do survival work. So this whole definition of work, I think, is one of the problems that's wrapped up with UBI. When people are bandying the word about, they're thinking a 9-to-5 job and contributing. But if that job's not actually contributing to society, you ought to be better at home studying for something completely new that really interests you, because that will benefit society in the longer run. But we're just not used to that kind of systems long-term thinking. It's a culture that's built around an industrial model that probably came out of World War II, where it's like work is virtuous just because. So that's hard.
I think that's right. It's really hard to define, what's work and what's not, and even what's productive and what's not. What I like to do, and I think sometimes you don't have to try to figure that out. You don't have to figure out, concretely, which things are specifically useful and which things are not, that kind of thing. In the back of my mind, the way I think about it, like what counts as work and what doesn't. Well, when I'm thinking about this kind of abstractly in my mind, I'm thinking everybody has 24 hours in a day. They're spending those 24 hours doing something. How do we create the incentives for them to optimally allocate that time? And I guess their effort as well. So really, everyone's the economy is always at full employment. Everyone is breathing 24 hours a day, right? That's one way to think about full employment. But then once you think about, kind of full employment that way, the concept of full employment becomes pointless and useless. And I think that's the right way to think, because I think that concept is kind of pointless and useless. It's a matter of how do we allocate people's time and effort for the greatest benefit. It's not, are you employed or not? Are you working or not? That's a matter of opinion.
Very good. I think this is a great place to leave it. I've really enjoyed this. Alex, where can people find you if they want to follow up on your work and understand this concept of yours better?
Yep. So at Alex Howlett, UBI on Twitter, or you can email me at alex@Greshm.org. So that's Gresham without the A, Greshm.
Very good. I would love to have you back on again. I think there's so much in this, especially around the culture of work, because I think that is something that really troubles people, that their work may not be as valuable as they thought. And I think that needs to be addressed. I think it's linked to that. And there may be other things that you let me know that you'd like to expand on, because I've really enjoyed this. I hope you have as too. So Jamie will be sorry he wasn't here. But thanks for
I just want to say one more thing,
Sure.
which is that if you have a job, you are receiving government handouts. Just think about that.
That's going to hurt some people, isn't it? The recoiling and gnashing of teeth to that one. Very good. All right. Good to chat with you. Talk to you again soon. Take care, Alex.
Resistance